Welcome back to the 293rd episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including two talking about the VPs on either side, one that's confirmed and the potentials on the other, and then we're going to talk about how the disinformation that could be made from AI actually hasn't been as pervasive yet, and some of the countermeasures that could be employed. And of course, we'll end today with our Daily Delight. A story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. Now, that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So, out of everybody that could be Kamala Harris's VP, there are a few that are starting to stand out. Who do you think would stand the best chance against J.D. Vance? If they were to do a debate, because before it was going to be Vance versus Kamala Harris, but now she is basically the heir apparent to Joe Biden. She's going to be the presidential nominee. She has already got her ads out there and everything. Who do you think would stand the best chance on stage with him? And if you don't have an opinion yet, listen a little bit, hear one of the major contenders that they're putting on stage, and whether or not he would be an option. So this last time, I talked about Andy Beshar. Now we're going to talk about Mr. Shapiro from Pennsylvania. But we'll get into that one. I do want to jump into the first article about J.D. Vance because I feel like this is what some traditional Republicans are talking about and how they feel with a man like Vance on the ticket. So the headline reads, Vance, like Biden, flukes Econ 101, backs hiking federal minimum wage. And when he says this, it's not like Bernie's attempt to, then again, Bernie did want to increase the federal minimum wage, but the one that Bernie actually was able to get through is about the federal workers that they were able to raise the minimum wage for, but it comes from the Cato Institute. So a libertarian institution, but also one that has a little bit of a different view on the border than some other libertarian institutions like the Mises Institute. So there's lots of different strands of libertarianism, but Cato's kind of been the mainstream one for quite some time, and they're coming after Mr. Vance here, which is interesting to say the least. So let's jump into what the article actually has to say. Quote, Vance is not alone in his devotion to government manipulating prices, of course. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris also back a 5% cap on rent increases for corporate landlords nationwide. So this was something that Biden had talked about. He kind of flubbed on it, but we're assuming, because guess what? This was written at a time when Joe Biden was actually still in the race. So we don't necessarily know if Kamala Harris is going to keep that going forward. I would assume that it probably falls within her purview because she does indeed have a little bit more of a progressive streak compared to Joe Biden, especially. So if Joe Biden could be convinced of this, she probably could be convinced of this as well. But that's the author kind of going at Joe Biden and Kamala Harris when that's not necessary. We're talking about J.D. Vance here, but I at least wanted to address that first because obviously the dynamics have changed a little bit since this article came out. Quote, my colleague, Ryan Bourne, has explained why that is a bad policy and documented how top economists are cold on the plan. Yet the prevalence for price controls is growing. Bourne calls it the war on prices, and raising minimum wage rates at the state and local level exemplify this trend. So he's really laying the stage here, which is there is a new movement on both sides, and I take that back. On one side, it's not necessarily that new, but on the right, there definitely is a new movement of people that see the government just how people that have traditionally been on the left, not necessarily a liberal, on the left, a little bit further out, which is the government is a tool in order to help the people that you have been voted in by, but not just by relieving regulations, but rather actually putting your thumb on the economic scales in order to benefit them specifically, mainly through giving certain money, benefits, subsidies, and things like that. For a long time there, a lot of conservatives, and let's be clear, I'm going back to maybe the early 1960s when you saw this sort of strain. There was a little bit different conservatism before that, of course, but in the modern era, before the populist movement and, after everything consolidated into the neoliberal system, which means that some liberals and conservatives were on board with this, it's really a free trade type policy. I'm sure you're fully aware of it. You've heard it a million times. Now, we've talked about this protectionism before on this podcast a whole bunch of times, which is sometimes I look at it and I say, okay, national security interest. I can see the argument there. The thing about national security interests, I always hate that language because while it's a great justification, a lot of things can be really thrown underneath the national security interest banner. So if you were to say that somebody's saying something on a college campus, or maybe someone's saying something online, or maybe someone is just saying something in the public square that is completely out of whack, it's a conspiracy theory, and it pins the blame on the FBI. You could say for national security interest that we can't allow this person to continue speaking if they have a big following because they're fomenting some sort of fear against the government. So when you start using the national security interest argument for me, it's not a slippery slope necessarily. It does not inherently mean, oh, once you start using this argument, it will fall down the hill. Because if you have other principles, which is limited government power, the ability to, like these principles of free speech and things of that nature actually are more important than the national security interest, then you can still have a balance of it. But even then, it does open the door. And that's the thing that is being argued, is almost always argued by a lot of people when they do huge investments in the industries that we find really important. Think about the CHIPS Act. And I talked about this, obviously, a long time ago, where the question of whether or not subsidizing these industries is good or bad. At first, I was kind of for it because national security interests, securing our supply chain against a possible invasion of Taiwan and strengthening our position with Taiwan, telling China that actually now we don't just have some financial interests, we're actually doing partnerships with them. So it's even more in our interest to protect Taiwan if you attack. All of these things make sense to me on a national security level. And I understand some people are not necessarily China hawks. And I also understand my position on China is different than other places around the world. When you listen back to some of my podcasts, you'll know that I have a very different perspective with China than I would with the Ukraine or necessarily some of the other issues that have cropped up around the world. And my point being that you can make a national security argument to me and it will resonate to some degree, but then it always comes with the little asterisks. And the asterisks in the case of the CHIPS Act was the fact that, are we actually making our companies here too dependent on U.S. aid? Are we actually trying to disentangle these markets where some products or aspects of the products, like the designs and things, could come from the United States and have to end up in China? And now that they can't actually get direct funding from the United States, and some of the executive orders that Biden put in place afterwards, where he's saying to other countries, you can't sell this sort of technology that's really needed for microchips to China. This was another thing that he enacted. It was a series of tariffs. Then are we actually forcing them to have a robust market, which means that they can rely solely on themselves for all of the things that they have to use to put into a microchip, all of the production processes, all the designing software, everything of that nature, and then they are completely free. Their system, their ecosystem that they have built up around producing these things, since it's so disentangled from the rest of the world, it's no longer a lever that we, the United States, or we as a allied force could leverage over them, saying, well, whoa, if you go to war with us, you're not going to get this microchip. You could actually force them into being more independent. So these sort of protectionist policies, these policies that are meant to really bolster the power of American companies at home, they require government intervention. And that's what Cato is coming for here. And you wonder, why, Alex, why are you going on this long protectionist rant? Because this is the shift within the GOP that's been happening for some time. And Trump spoke to it a little bit, but never enacted something that was truly protectionist besides some of his tariffs. But he would argue that they had national security implications. And that's also why I brought up the national security angle, because that is the justification that some people use when these protective tariffs come in place. And I'm sure it is the argument that will be used in the future, which is we need to ensure that our supply chains are safe, especially after COVID. That is resonant in people's minds, that masks we had to get from China, we weren't able to get them. Those, I've talked to people who that is still resonant in their mind, and they use that argument in order to ensure that more money goes into U.S. industries for national security purposes. So this is a new strain, and that person I was talking to is actually not on the conservative side of the aisle. So you could see that there is actually going to be a double push here from protectionism, and it really is a populist swelling when it comes to where it's coming from on the right side of the aisle. And even on the left side, even though this populism's just been going on longer, so it feels less like populism and more just like the voter base, it still is populism to some degree. And now we're starting to see it affect the right as well. Quote, Vance would bring the policy of minimum wage hikes to D.C. The current federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. In the fall of 2023, however, Vance co-sponsored a Republican bill, quote, the Higher Wages for American Workers Act. This legislation gradually raises the federal minimum wage to $11 by 2028 and then indices it to inflation every 2 years. Reads a fact sheet on the bill. The legislation also mandates E-Verify to ensure rising wages go to legally authorized workers. So this is really interesting. So he's saying every state will have to basically have $11 as their minimum wage. It's going to be an incremental thing that goes up, and also indexes for inflation. And that's really, really cool, right? If you want your wages to continue going up, that's amazing. Yeah, hey, it's going to keep pace with inflation. Also, it could exacerbate inflation because guess what? More money going into the economy, meaning that there is more money chasing fewer goods. You're actually devaluing the dollar over time with this, or at least the purchasing power of the dollar in U.S. terms. Now, if you're looking across the world, that changes anyway comparatively between nations and currencies. But the point being that it's a very interesting policy. And Vance lays out the argument a little bit later on, which is we actually want to increase the minimum wage. So even if these companies who are bringing in people, lower wage employees from outside the United States, they don't necessarily have citizenship here. And that's why the E-Verify part of this is very crucial. We want to increase the wages so that it's actually cheaper for McDonald's to get rid of some people, keep someone who's getting paid that $11 and put in a kiosk. Because if the person who's coming from a different place, if this illegal worker, a legal migrant to the United States who doesn't have a green card, doesn't have a working permit, if it's cheaper for the company to hire them rather than, he uses McDonald's explicitly in his talk with Ross Douthat from the New York Times. So if it's cheaper for them to actually hire out somebody rather than, pay for the kiosk and the subscription service that would come along with it, then they're going to hire the person that is not a worker from this country, and they will pay him whatever the minimum wage is, or at least closer to it, than the average U.S. worker who's being disenfranchised by that person who is an illegal immigrant. And it's a very interesting argument, and it sounds really, really nice when we first look at the situation. But the question is, why do you need the minimum? In my opinion, Cato takes it a totally different way, but why do you need the minimum wage? Why don't you just have E-Verify? Why don't you just make E-Verify absolute standard? I understand that's hard. That makes it really weird. But if you want to ensure that only jobs can go to people who have working permits to work within the United States or citizens, just make sure E-Verify is actually implementable. So why wouldn't you just put the extra money? And this is me saying, if you're going to spend the money anyway, why wouldn't you just put the extra money that you're going to spend on ensuring that all these different regulations go into place, the monitors that make sure that everybody's getting paid the right amount, so on and so forth? Why wouldn't you just put that towards monitors and making sure that everybody does E-Verify? Obviously, some people aren't going to necessarily do E-Verify. They're going to try to skirt around it. There's always going to be some workarounds. But if the issue is the illegal migrants, why not do E-Verify unless you want to give more money? You just want to raise the minimum wage to raise the standard of living, essentially, but therefore actually raising the cost of things. Because if you have a community, so let's say you have a community, we're going to go back to economics. Let's say you have a community of 5 people, and Ron has something that everybody really likes. He has an apple tree, and he only has 1 apple this year. And the going price between the 4 other people is $5. And that's because they all make a minimum wage of $7.50. And they say, oh, hey, we really like the apple. We still need enough to survive, but we'll pay $5. We'll pay $5. That's basically 2/3 of the amount of money that we make in order to buy your apple, Ron. And then Ron's like, oh, okay, great. Now imagine all those people get paid $10, and they still only need maybe 2.5 in order to live. But we could even say that they need like $3 $3 of the 10 to survive, then they say, well, we still really want this apple. The supply is still there. And Ron's like, okay, well, there's more money in the system now. I still have the same amount of an apple because I haven't adjusted for it. There's also some natural determinants there. It's just how it is. My apple tree only produced one this year. So now you can get $7 for it because at the end of the day, yes, there should be a free market mechanism, but there is also the fact that when the amount of supply is locked and the demand increases, the price for that good is going to go up. And when you have more money to spend, guess what? You're going to want to pay more for it if you value it that much. Now, yes, I technically understand that just because supply remains the same, that demand is going to go up. That does not actually hold true. In the fictitious world that I created, where the supply is exactly staying the same and people still value it the same way, then the demand would go up. And by demand, I mean the amount of raw dollars that would be chasing that one good. Then this specific example, if you want to try to pull it apart, I understand. I should have put the context in there that those are a few of the presuppositions and the assumptions that are baked in to that equation. But that's what happens when we have minimum wage. It's not always true because guess what? Sometimes things get cheaper. Not necessarily in the world that we have where we have government mandated inflation, essentially, where we always want to hit 2% because we want to stimulate economic growth, or we want to make it at least look like that on paper. But in some worlds, actually things get cheaper because processes become more efficient, companies become better at creating things, they innovate new ways to make things, they find cheaper labor sometimes, all these sort of things. So it's a really interesting case that J.D. Vance makes. If you want to read this article, I would read the Cato Institute article. I would also go watch the interview between Vance and Ross Douthat, because if you're not a person who likes the New York Times, I would still say that Ross Douthat at least tries to give J.D. Vance a very fair take here. This was before he was even running for vice president, so this is just while he was in the Senate at that point. So it's a really interesting talk. I would go read it. The link will be in the description below, the like and subscribe button, where you can find all of the articles from today. But normally I save that till the end, so I'm just going to keep on rolling to our other story about a VP. And this one, J.D. Vance, he's locked in. This next one is about a potential VP. Like I said, we talked about Beshar last time. Now we're going to talk about Mr. Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania. This comes from the New Republic. The headline reads, "The once vice presidential pick who could ruin Democratic unity." And I'm gonna look at this. I'm gonna say, okay, why? In the New Republic, remember, they used to be pretty moderate. They have changed up their tune a little bit, but Josh Shapiro, he's in a very crucial swing state. He is very popular within that swing state. He even came out after the shooting at the Trump rally, the attempted assassination, and he was willing to put aside just the politics for a little bit and just be a human being. I'm not saying he's riding that high, but my point is that he is a skilled politician who also has a heart, and he's not just there trying to stab everybody in the back. At least that's the image that he portrays. But he's also a very effective actor. And he's a very effective actor who supports Israel, which is, I don't want to say it's rare on the Democratic side, but you find them more seldom nowadays than you could in the past. And the article tries to make a argument here that, well, the new left, the coalition that's forming on the left now, especially the one that's progressive enough to want to put Kamala Harris in the White House, they're not going to necessarily like themselves a Mr. Shapiro. Quote, "For rank-and-file leftists, however, any goodwill Biden might have banked on domestic policy had long since been squandered. For more than 9 months following Hamas's October 7th, 2023 attacks on Israel, Biden has fully enabled Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's reprisal campaign and his his war crimes against the Palestinians of Gaza." So, also, I think this is unfair because you could make an argument in my book where he does just fully say, "Oh, Netanyahu, you can do whatever you want to do," and in actions alone, yeah, that's fair enough. He has basically said, Netanyahu, you go do you. Guess what? Netanyahu, he runs his own country, okay? He does not need the United States permission to do anything. At least in a world where we actually live in sovereign states, he wouldn't need to. Now, I understand aid is tied to certain things. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But the point that the author is getting at here is Joe Biden couldn't get over this one because it is a strong issue. That's more the point I want to get at. It doesn't really matter whether Joe Biden was the best or worst on it. It's the fact that he is perceived as bad on it, and that is one among many reasons that people on the left were not wanting to vote for him. And guess what? Mr. Shapiro, Josh Shapiro, he is a person who is very pro-Israel. If you want me to throw the other thing out there, he is of Jewish descent. But I don't really think that necessarily matters, because even if he wasn't of Jewish descent and he was very, very pro-Israel, I don't think his actual ethnicity would matter. It would just be about his policy record. And his policy record shows very pro-Israel policies. He actually tried to crack down on some of the protests that happened in Pennsylvania over all of the things going on. He also passed some different... Actually, hold on, let me read it here. Quote, in his previous role as Pennsylvania Attorney General, Shapiro championed the state's constitutionally dubious anti-BDS boycott, divest, sanction laws against Ben & Jerry's after the ice cream maker refused to license its products for sale in Israeli settlements. BDS is rooted in anti-Semitism, Shapiro wrote in a statement in 2021, as he condemned a company named for its two Jewish American founders. The stated goal of, this is his quote again, quote, the stated goal of this amorphous movement is the removal of Jewish citizens from the region, and I strongly oppose their efforts. End quote. So he's made no qualms of it. He has used his positions in order to actually fight for issues like this, support Israel, be an ally of the nation. And that's not going to go over well with a group of people who really empathize and care about the Palestinians. They care about this issue very, very deeply. And that's what the New Republic is saying. When they say at the very top here, the one vice presidential candidate pick who could ruin Democratic unity. It's not, I don't want to say it's true, because either some people are going to hold their nose or it doesn't matter. I'm going to be honest. If they put them on the ticket, I'm sorry, the leftists, even if they don't like the policies with Hamas, even if they don't like the policies with the Palestinians, even if they don't like the policies with the Israelis, guess what? They're probably still going to vote Democrat. I believe that in my heart of hearts that they would still vote Democrat, or maybe there's a few of them that will go Jill Stein or maybe even Cornel West. But there's none of them that will go RFK, and there's definitely none of them that would go for Donald Trump. And also, you could overlook it. He's a VP versus Kamala Harris, who has been more than willing to talk about the Palestinian plight and go out there and do campaign speeches on it. And she uses that language, the Palestinian plight, okay? So I can't do a Kamala impression yet. I was going to try. I can't do one yet. But my point being that I think that it's not really going to matter. I think New Republic's being a little bit overdramatic, but it's definitely not something that they're overlooking. It is definitely part of their vetting process. There is no doubt about that. And they are sitting there like, yeah, I don't know if that's going to play well with the base. The Kamala team is definitely doing that. So I think that they read people at the, they, like other people, read the New Republic and they're like, okay, yep, the people, at least the loudest activists have spoken. They do not want Mr. Ben Shapiro. So it will be interesting. Do you think that, and like I'm going to tie it back to that question that I asked, do you think that Mr. Shapiro could take on a Mr. Vance? I think Shapiro could take on a Vance. I think he could be very competent on that stage when it comes to debating. Would he have all the right positions on all the issues? Probably not. Would he be able to outsmart J.D. Vance? I honestly don't know, but he is a wicked politician, and there's no doubt about that. He's been at this game a little bit longer than Mr. Vance has. But that's all for that. Leave your comments down there. Love to hear it. Let's jump in to our last story that comes from the Daily Beast. Deep fakes haven't destroyed democracy, yet, which is just so reassuring. They haven't destroyed democracy yet. It's not really a question mark, but it's very interesting when we had all these AI technologies coming out, the deep fake voices, the deep fake video, all of these different services that could, in theory, be used to create information, or at least the appearance of information, that would not benefit certain political people. And we remember there was the instance of the Joe Biden call in one of the primaries. I believe it was actually New Hampshire, where he said, we don't need you to come out for the vote, basically. It's actually not going to help, blah, blah, blah. And it turned out that was actually from a rogue Democratic operative. But the point being that it did have some effect. And we were surprised, at least I was surprised, and so was Daily Beast. They were surprised that more of these things haven't popped up. Quote, while there have been some instances involving AI, they didn't overwhelm society's ability to debunk them, and none of them constituted significant political disruption, even as they have become easier to make by orders of magnitude. So my question, it raises one in my head, which is maybe the people who would want to influence anything are going to do it as a last minute push, but also actually getting the video out there and advertising and putting in the money to start all these accounts and get all the servers running. If you were to do a proper campaign, if you were a really bad actor, it would be quite expensive. And that's what the authors go on to say, which is it's time consuming. There has to be a coordinated effort. In these other countries that may want to influence it, it's a lot to do. And for any private actor, they may not even have the resources to do it. But that doesn't mean it's stopping the Daily Beast from at least looking at the situation. Quote, the theoretical prospect of the free world descending into a real-life Black Mirror episode was irresistible and convincing, talking about this idea at the very beginning. But as reality set in and people sobered up, the emerging questions were, if fake media had the power to swing elections, why has Photoshop not been weaponized by the FSB, CIA, CCP to sow discord in prior decades? If fake audio recordings are such a powerful influence tool, why haven't foreign intelligence agencies hired and trained impersonators since the dawn of recorded sound? And it's interesting because they don't necessarily need impersonators. They use much more straightforward, which is, it's interesting because deepfakes is highly coordinated. It takes a lot of work versus just broadcasting a network, a news station, sounds official into other countries. Guess what? The United States does that. We do that over in Iran. We have our own little broadcast that we send through all the time. Russia has the same thing in multiple satellites near it. And I'm 90% certain the U.S. also does this with Russia. We send in some sort of Russian news. The point being that there are cheaper ways to try to influence things rather than doing these deep fakes. But that doesn't mean it's not possible. You got to watch out. If there's not a normal October surprise this year, which I think there will be a normal October surprise anyway, I wouldn't be surprised if some deep fakes from either side came out. And when I say from either side, I'm not implying that either side's going to put them out necessarily, but attacking either side, maybe is the better way to put it, which is, I think there's going to be some really crazy Democrat operative versus some very, very crazy Republican operative that are both trying to put out some fake information and trying to sway people's votes away from the other. Then again, the authors did say it was overblown, and maybe that's true. Also, some AI programs, not all of them, some of the ones that are a little bit more free or aren't as good don't necessarily put the same restrictions on their programs. But I want to say that ChatGPT has actually done a very, very good job of locking things down. As you know, I do thumbnails, obviously, and I've had a hard time making public figures. That's why I've had to go back to the old AI model I used before ChatGPT. And even then, I really wanted to find a way to work around it because it's not like I want to make any fake information. It's not like I want to make any deep fakes. I just want to be able to get competent looking pictures of the people that aren't necessarily photocopied or licensed and be able to make a cool thumbnail around it. So it's an interesting future. Some companies have really locked down on it, but maybe there are private models that can do all sorts of things that we don't know about, and these countries have been developing it, and they're waiting for the right time to test it when the time is most critical. It's always possible. I'm not trying to be like a nihilist, but we need to at least keep our minds open to the possibilities. We need to be unencumbered by what has been so we can focus on what we can be. And I know that's probably a more concise way of putting what Kamala Harris has said, but it's an interesting line from her, no dad, or what you think. So let's jump to our daily delight. And this story comes from the Miami Herald. Mom not prepared for where she finds son morning after they rescue a dog. And this TikTok of the son and dog sitting, or actually the son sleeping next to the dog after they had brought it in from the cold. And it was honestly adorable. It's heartwarming. This family says they bring in dogs all the time. And this son, he was like, I don't want the dog to be alone, basically. So he went and cuddled up with him. He slept with him, made sure that this dog felt like this is a place that he could be. I don't know if they're going to keep him. They mentioned that sometimes they pass on the dogs. Like they get them from any area that's endangered, and then they pass them on to be adopted somewhere else. But either way, it's a very cute, adorable photo, and the sentiment of this young man is very, very amazing, and we love to see it. It touches your heart. So if you want to check out that video, or you want to check out any of today's articles, like I mentioned before, there's a link in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Casts, Google Podcast is no longer a thing, but it's also on Podvine. And you can find the Twitter handle at @YourDailyFlip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. So with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.